So hello and welcome to the Sciences of the Origin project. We are glad to have you join us as we delve into the philosophical and methodological foundations of the scientific quest for the origins of the universe, life, and mind. The main aim of this project is to discuss common methodological challenges of cosmology, biology, and archaeology. The Sciences of the Origin interviews are supported by the University of Oxford project, New Horizons, for Science and Religion in Central and Eastern Europe, funded by John Templeton Foundation. My name is Monika Milosavljević, and I am an assistant professor at the University of Belgrade. My guest today is philosopher of science, Adrian Currie. Adrian is currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Philosophy, and Anthropology at University of Exeter. His research interests cover philosophy of biology and historical sciences, as well as social epistemology and the quest of creativity knowledge production. He is also one of the founders of The Extinct, a blog covering the intersection between philosophy and paleontology. Adrian is the author of The Rock, Bone, and Ruin, an optimist guide to the historical sciences. Also author of The Scientific Knowledge and the Deep Past, History Matters, as well as Comparative Thinking in Biology book, which was published last year. So hello, Adrian. Thank you for being with us today.
Hi, Monika. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. So I would like to start off by asking maybe very general questions. So why are some important questions only answerable for the perspective of the deep science?
It's a great question. So maybe the way to start answering that is to get to grips with how incredibly unrepresentative this little time slice, this little minutiae of time that we currently live in. So if you think about climate science, we've had pretty good recorded temperatures of global temperatures for what, maybe at a century or at roughly. And if you think about the enormous variety in global temperatures over millions of years, a century's information is just not going to be good enough to get to grips with how varied things are. If you were to go around and look at global biota today, if you were to go around looking at, say, large animals, so you're interested in, big animals, if you were to go around and look at them today, you would think, oh, that's kind of interesting that all of the big animals seem to live in Africa and Western Asia. Where are all the big animals in America or Australia or Europe? And the answer, of course, is that many of them went extinct towards the end of the Pleistocene. These are things that if you just take the way the world is now as a guide to the way the world has always been, you're going to massively misrepresent and misunderstand the way that the world is, right? The way that things are now is a result of the way that things were in the past. And so if you want to understand the way things are now, you need to understand the past as well. Maybe another sort of more, I suppose, social, moral, or political aspect is that the past is often used as a way of shaping the way we see the world now, right? The past is a kind of furniture that we kind of live in, right? I'm a, colonial product of, Europeans moving to New Zealand in the 19th century. And that's a thing that sort of shapes my self-conception, but it's also something that can be, as it were, used to control me or used to manipulate me in various kinds of ways. And caring about what actually happened in the past, caring about the truth of the past, gives us, in a sense, a kind of bulwark against the use of history to, as it were, manipulate people.
Oh, that's great. Well said. But yeah, we have some problems with the past and sciences of the past. So maybe to discuss that a little bit. So if scientists are hostages to their own theoretical ideas, as well as if trace-based reasoning is vulnerable, is there a room for optimism when we are studying historical sciences?
Well, I certainly think there is, but we need to be careful about, I guess I want to go through each three parts of that question and try and give my view on them. So first, of course, any sort of scientific investigation is going to be deeply sort of theory laden in various ways, right? No one thinks in any area of investigation that somehow the world just comes to me for free and goes, here's my data, so on and so forth. Lots of folks, particularly those in archaeology, are deeply worried about the idea that because the remnants you get from the past are so degraded and so on and so forth, that there aren't going to be very many constraints on our interpretation. That, as you sort of put it, my pre-existing ideas, my sort of theories are going to be in the driving seat. And I actually think that the ways that archaeologists in particular respond to this should give us reason for some kind of optimism. So what archaeologists do, in my view, is three things. The first is a kind of reflective practice. There's lots of archaeologists, whether they're kind of archaeologists who fall more on the sciencey side of the spectrum or more on the humanities or arts side of the spectrum, they're all continually reflecting on the ways in which their pre-existing ideas might be might be leading their interpretation. There's also a social aspect. There's a sort of intersubjectivity aspect to it. Archaeologists are very aware that it's not their own interpretation standing on its own that does the work. It's rather a community of people with a community of interpretations and then being engaged with each other. And where I think the rubber really hits the road, and this is a lesson I take from Alison Wiley's work, is that the materiality makes an enormous difference. What I think that Wiley is right when she says that archaeologists aren't really led by theory, they're led by materials. What you're doing when you're an archaeologist is you're engaging with this material record, which just won't bend any which way. The material record can be extremely stubborn. And so there are many examples of people trying to get the material record to fit to their pre-existing ideas and the material record flatly refusing. And so I do think that there is a lot of room for sort of optimism when that kind of threefold strategy is in play, right? I think it's a mistake to think that the way that we understand historical science, where we understand investigations of the deep past, is in terms of there being these overriding theories, right? Actually, things are a patchwork, things are messy, and that's part of their power. In terms of optimism, so why? Because I have this, as you mentioned, the sort of title of my book has this word optimism in it. There's something very odd about that. Why? What am I talking about? Well, on the one hand, it's doing two bits of work for me. One is I'm trying to change the conversation. When people think about the philosophy of the philosophy of science generally, people ask this question: should I believe what scientists say? Do scientists give us true stuff? And that's a very good question. That's a question, of course, we should pay attention to. But that's not the only question we should care about. In the cases with things like paleontology and archaeology, one question we might ask is, should I believe that, say, the dinosaurs were knocked out by a giant rock? Or should I believe, say, that the reason that the megafauna in the Pleistocene was wiped out was because modern humans turned up and ate them, right? Are those hypotheses I should believe or not? Optimism is supposed to lead us away from asking about whether we are getting the actual knowledge of the past and asking after a much broad array of sort of epistemic goods. I think there are lots of examples where historical scientists are chasing a hypothesis which is very unlikely to be true. It's incredibly implausible that this is going to come out being right. But nonetheless, chasing that hypothesis generates a whole bunch of surprising, interesting knowledge about a whole variety of different things. And so I think that there's been this very narrow focus, particularly in philosophy of science, but I think also more generally when folks think about the epistemic credentials, whether they're a good science question about things like paleontology and archaeology. They focus on, does it tell me what actually happens in the past? And sometimes, yes, they do that, but focusing narrowly on that question means that we miss this beautiful array of other kinds of knowledge. Often this knowledge takes the form of, for instance, capacities, right? We've learned that this is a type of social arrangement that could exist. We've learned that under certain conditions, this is how the environment and the, say, atmosphere might interact. It gives us modal knowledge of how things could be. And I think that knowledge, maybe I'm weird, but I tend to find that knowledge more exciting than, what happened to happen on this one little timeline that we're following.
Yeah, I like that plurality of knowledge that archaeology can give us, and also that material culture and context can surprise us. But I want to ask also, is there any difference how we should treat different traces? For example, material culture, written record, animal remains, fossils. Is there any difference in epistemological terms?
What a
between
great
those?
question. I guess it depends a little bit on how abstract we're asking the question, right? Because there's something I can say which I can give you a framework very easily that has that can make them all look the same, right? So the make them all look the same framework might be what Anton Killen and I have called trace-based reasoning, which I think you mentioned earlier, which is just I've got an object, I've got a bit of knowledge, a sort of regularity that tells me about how that object would change through the past. And then I infer backwards. So I have a bit of historical text. I have my sort of historical knowledge about how it is that that text may be produced in that context, what would lead to it to be developed. And I use that, a bit of theory to infer from the past. Insert whatever trace you want, that's going to kind of fit. But of course, that's pretty abstract. And of course, there are these really, really big differences. I suppose my view on this is a little bit like this. There are lots and lots of differences, but I don't think there are any special differences. And let me explain that. There's this kind of beautiful discussion that I find myself keep going back to in Collingwood, of all people, where Collingwood says, look, there's just a fundamental difference between what a paleontologist is doing and what an archaeologist is doing. When a paleontologist is digging up remains, they're doing what he thinks of as kind of science. You're thinking of these things as the remains of these biological creatures. You're thinking about them as sort of in causal terms. An archaeologist is digging up materials that they're thinking of as intentional. They're digging up materials that humans did stuff with, humans with purposes. And for someone like Collingwood, that's a profound difference. Now, I agree that, of course, there's a difference between conceiving of what I'm digging up as being the remains of an extinct organism and conceiving of what I'm digging up as an artifact that was put to some use by some previous human. But I'm not sure, and that makes some epistemic difference, but I'm not sure whether that epistemic difference is supposed to be more important or more interesting, say, than a paleontologist, for instance, who is digging up a invertebrate fossil versus a paleontologist who's digging up a vertebrate fossil, because invertebrate fossils, particularly aquatic ones, we should think that they're going to fossilize more often than vertebrate ones. That's going to make a big difference to the way that I treat that data, the kinds of inferences I'm interested in making, the kind of targets I might have. So there's this kind of idea that runs through quite a lot of the philosophy of history that says something like something special happens once intentionality is around, once you've got these humans around. And I agree that humans make things in some ways more complicated. It's just not obvious to me that they make them specially more complicated.
I agree, but I'm also thinking about intentionality of animals. And that's an interesting question for me, how we recognize that in human-animal relations. So that's something to think about, but maybe another time.
Yeah.
Okay. You made a great syntax, methodological omnivore strategy. So I want to ask you, how can the sciences of the deep past progress by using that strategy?
Okay, so it's important to have catchy labels, and methodological omnivore is a mouthful, but it has a certain evocativeness to it. So here's the kind of way I was thinking when I was developing this model. There are lots of sciences. The ones I'm often thinking of here are things like particle physics or sort of certain forms of sort of experimental lab biology, particularly that working on model organisms, where it seems to me that they've struck a very, very deep vein of knowledge. They've got a really productive kind of strategy. If I sit here with this E. coli, I've got a whole bunch of different, there's the set of really effective techniques that I can use to generate a lot of knowledge from this like little experimental system. You might think of that as a kind of methodological obligate. So an obligate, say carnivore, is something like a polar bear. Polar bears eat seals, and that's pretty much it. They're very, very, very good at it. If you want something to kill a seal, polar bear's your guy, right? And the thing that's going to make you a sort of obligate is that there's this kind of focus. You've got a small set of very, very effective tools and techniques. Now, if you're trying to understand the deep past in many contexts, not necessarily all, it doesn't look like that strategy is going to work, because you've got such a degraded, such a heterogeneous, such a messy kind of set of data, and for that matter, a messy system that you're trying to understand. The past is very rarely simple and easy. And so what you want to do is, as it were, throw everything at the wall you can and see what sticks. That's the kind of strategy. So you behave more like a brown bear, right? Brown bears are omnivorous. What they do is eat whatever on earth they can. If you're a brown bear, you're like, all right, I've got to, winter's going to come soon. I'm going to have to hibernate. I just need to maximize my calorie intake. And there's some real differences between the sorts of standards you should do if you're that type of scientist. So the obligate, like the polar bear, one way of thinking about it is they're going for the best possible, highest quality calories. Whereas the brown bear is like, just give me whatever calories you can. And why that's a good strategy, why that's justified, is because brown bears and polar bears live in such different contexts. Similarly, if you're trying to understand, the life ways of long extinct animals, or if you're trying to understand the way that, say, human cultures, developed, thousands of years ago, you're much more in a sort of brown bear sort of scenario. You need to take in and integrate as much evidence as you can. The thing that I think makes this notion of a methodological omnivore distinctive, right? Because you could just say, sure, you're just talking about the convergence of evidence. We need, a lot of consilience in order to do this. The thing that I'm really struck by when I look at paleontologists and archaeologists is the extent to which they're not merely in the business of finding evidence and integrating it. They're in the business of creating these highly attuned, really flexible tools that they're able to adapt to particular situations. In lots of, across lots of sciences, it's very rare to find someone, for instance, doing a master's thesis, and that master's thesis being a technological or methodological innovation. Usually a master's thesis, say in a lab, is you're doing your little master's thesis and you're, the head of the lab's just like, hey, generate this data, do some stuff. Whereas it's quite often, in my experience, you'll find paleontologists and archaeologists, even at the level of master's thesis, being like, I'm developing a new computer model to do this. I'm trying to see what happens if I do this with the CT scanner. I'm trying to build this weird thing, right? So it's a much, much more, in my mind, sort of creative and sort of open-ended way of knowledge creation. And I think why they do it like that is intimately connected to the kind of epistemic situation they're in, right? When you've got such a, what I've called recently a sort of evidentially impoverished situation where, not evidentially, epistemically impoverished, because, I can't remember. Anyway, when you're in this apparently impoverished situation, then you need
unlucky,
to be...
maybe.
One of those.
Yeah.
I'll have to look it up. You need to be very creative in order to get anywhere with that knowledge. And that's what makes the science so exciting to me.
And that's great. So as a part of that story, you said that underdetermination, which is the reason why most of us are pessimistic, that underdetermination improperly frames the challenges of historical sciences. So can you explain your view on underdetermination? Okay, I can try. So this is something which is developing in an ongoing way, and I'm pretty sure I contradict myself in various papers about this. So I'll do my best to summarize one version of what I think. So the underdetermination we're interested in here is what Derek Turner has called local underdetermination. So often when philosophers of science talk about underdetermination, they're interested in a question which I consider pretty boring, which is something like, hey, for any collection of evidence, in principle, there can be another hypothesis other than the one that's going that could equally accommodate that evidence. Sure, maybe in principle that's true, but it doesn't tell me very much about the practice of scientific knowledge. The type of underdetermination that we're interested in, this local type, is one that says, well, given this set of evidence, given the available evidence that we have, and given the plausible hypotheses, whatever plausible means, we have on the table, this evidence is not enough to distinguish between those hypotheses. It speaks equally to both of them, right? That's a very, very common situation that paleontologists find themselves in, right? You have to, speaks equally might be, they're going to disagree on whether or not the stuff speaks equally, but often things are not closed in that sense, they're open. And indeed, that's not surprising, because if it wasn't underdetermined, we would know the answer.
The thing that really matters here is, should we expect that underdetermination to be solved downstream? Should we think that it's sort of a kind of robust underdetermination where no matter what we try, no matter how hard we try, we're not going to get anywhere with it? Or should we think that it's a, that it's something that will be resolved? Now, one thing to immediately say is that's a slightly weird question to pose generally, because surely there are going to be some cases of underdetermination where I should be very optimistic that we'll find some kind of answer to it. So if we've developed sort of a new technology, so for instance, 15 years ago, had you asked me, will we ever know whether Neanderthal or Homo sapiens interbred? I would have gone, I don't know, I'm not sure. Go like, maybe not, I can't imagine. Maybe go 5-10 years into the future and someone's like, hey, there's this thing called ancient DNA and we're able to sequence it. Do you think we will ever find out whether Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interbred? I'd be like, yes, I can see now, right? And so context is going to matter enormously. The thing that I think nowadays about underdetermination, and picking up on the sort of question you asked, which was, why do I think that it's a wrong way of thinking about things, is because I just think that underdetermination leads us to a certain type of impasse. Because the more you think about scientific practice, the more you think about the actual processes of how scientists generate knowledge, the more complex and intractable bets about whether something is going to remain undetermined or not becomes, right? It isn't simply that, you have to consider whether or not the information was preserved across, paleontological time, or whether the archaeologists have the right background knowledge to be able to make those inferences. It's also, how have they controlled the data? What access do they have to the data? How has the data traveled? What sort of publishing contexts do they have? What kind of resources do they have at their commands to help them generate this knowledge? So actually, when you think about science as this kind of social, economic, political entity, then the question that says, should we expect underdetermination to be overcome or not, starts to just be an incredibly intractable question. And so what I think we should do instead is think about the kinds of strategies that scientists adopt given the resources at their commands. Different scientists have different, if you want, affordances. Some of them have access to different kinds of things, and also they're interested in different types of systems. And these things challenge them in different ways. And so when I'm asking after the success or otherwise of a science, if I'm saying, should I be optimistic about the science? The question should not be, I think at least, should we expect this particular or that particular bit of knowledge that's currently underdetermined to stop being underdetermined? We should ask, given the context, given the sort of scenarios and the challenges they're facing, is this the right strategy? Is this a productive way of doing science? Now, if so, that does let us be optimistic in a certain kind of way. Perhaps I shouldn't be optimistic about whether a particular bit of knowledge will be generated, but I should be optimistic that lots of knowledge will be generated. And I take it part of what's supposed to be exciting about this is precisely that I don't know what that could end up being. I don't think you could go back 25 years ago and look at, for instance, the state of paleoanthropology. So, science into the evolution of, how Homo sapiens arose, and possibly predict the way things look now, right? They're just so different. And I think that's what's so exciting about this stuff.
Yeah, we are living in great times and science evolve, and that's great. But I need to ask about non-replicability also, because, for example, it's a really important comment that I have. So your science, archaeology, is not real science because of non-replicability. And I don't know how to answer to that. So help me with that.
Yeah. So here's a extremely philosophical beginning to a response. What do we mean by replicability here? Because paleontologists actually have a notion of replicability, which is really interesting. In a recent letter, the Society for Vertebrate Paleontology argued that it was really important to have publicly owned, well-controlled fossils, because it's really important for people to be able to go and look at the original specimen. Why? Because that's a form of replicability. I cannot say that word, replicability for them, right? They're thinking of replicability in terms of one paleontologist has gone and done an analysis of the specimen, and then they've written it up. Now, in order to replicate that, another paleontologist needs to go and look at the specimen and then write that up, which is a very different notion of replicability than what we see in, basically statistics, right? So replicability is more or less a notion that comes out of the combination of experiment combined with statistics. And there's actually a lot of, to put it bluntly, philosophy, which is, I'm going a little bit over my head. I haven't looked at it very carefully at the moment, but there's a lot of really interesting work at the moment about the nature of replicability, even in those sciences. So I suppose, so that's one response. One response is actually there are notions of replicability which are suitable to these sorts of sciences that are based on specimens. Another thing that might be lying behind this notion of replicability could be the idea that, well, maybe it's the case that the things that we're interested in understanding in the past are unique. Maybe, in some sense, the data isn't replicable because the objects aren't replicable. They are, the contingent processes, contingent outputs of this, highly heterogeneous contingent set of, forces in the world. Yeah, that makes things hard. But to say that something somehow doesn't count as scientific because it's not meeting a particular kind of standard, I think is to be, to put it bluntly, it's extremely naive about the nature of science. Science is not, so one way of putting it is, there's not really any philosophers of science that I know of that take seriously the idea that there's such a thing as the scientific method. And if you go on the internet and Google the scientific method, you'll find lots of cute flow diagrams and so forth. And those are very abstract and very nice, but calling on what I was talking about earlier, when we're thinking about what science is and how science works, you can't just grab some one-size-fits-all abstract idea about what good knowledge production looks like, because knowledge production is incredibly sensitive to context. What's a great thing for someone who is an experimental scientist working in a lab to do would be a completely fruitless thing for a paleontologist to do, and vice versa, right? So the challenge that says, here's one way of putting it. I think given that at least often, replicability is not a thing that historical scientists are able to do, I think it speaks to how impressive their knowledge producing capacities are, that we're able to get such kind of rich and often highly plausible pictures of how the past was.
Thank you for saying that. That's extremely important for my responses in future to that question. So, but when researching origins of the mind, for example, or cultural phenomena in Paleolithic or art in prehistory, where is the danger of selection effect or any archaeological biases there?
Well, of course, they're always there, but you might think that there are certain questions that are especially prone to these sorts of problems. And I take it the things that are going to be the real sort of trouble spot are going to be cases that first don't get much constraint from the materials, from the evidence that we have, things that are very open. And second are things that matter to us in particular ways that are very sort of, if you want, kind of politically or culturally or emotionally charged, because those are the places where you're going to get real conflict between like the way that sort of interpretations go. And of course, it's impossible to tell the history about the study of human origins without telling the story of, colonialism and, racism and, imperialism, right? These things are directly tied into one another, and you can't explain why things went as they did without paying attention to that. And I suppose what we should do about that, or how we should worry about that, I suppose one thing is to sort of hail back to what I said earlier on in our conversation about archaeology and the way that archaeologists respond to these problems of interpretation, is that the sort of combination of sort of reflexivity, of sort of really being conscious of the fact that you're inevitably going to be biased, right? You can't get rid of those biases, because in fact, of course, that's what you're bringing to your science often, right? Why are you doing the science that you're doing? Wow, why am I interested in these questions, right? Why is it that if I discover like some tiny little hominid that, existed 100,000 years ago, that gets me the front page of Nature. Whereas me discovering an entire new, a sort of an entire new, what's an example? Something that seems equally important, I get like a much smaller publication. It's because we care about humans, we care about ourselves, we think we're special. And so anytime we're doing a sort of science of humanity, we need to be really sort of careful. I suppose this is maybe a rather sort of a thing that's easy to say from the privilege of both being someone who's not very vulnerable, but also being someone who is a philosopher and so can sit from the sidelines while the scientists do their thing, is there's a sense in which it can be very difficult to recognize the ways in which these prejudices are affecting and shaping our science, right? So in the sort of 1950s, when people were assuming that, adopting this kind of hunting thing and eating all this meat was like just critically important for the evolution of human culture, I don't think if you'd asked them, you don't think that, the fact that you're living in a, highly masculinized culture that sort of has these things that's sort of affecting the way you're thinking there, they'd be like, I don't think so. I imagine that there are lots of those things going on now. And I kind of can't wait for it to be 40 years from now and to have hopefully found out some more of these things, right? I mean, I found that, to speak personally, my life has been this slightly annoying unfolding of all of the various ways in which I've been unable to realize things which are very obvious in retrospect. And you might think that with things like the understanding of sort of human evolution at a social level, things will probably look really similar.
Yeah, that will be interesting to see. So we will see, hopefully, that. And another thing that worries me is public archaeology. So how should scientists and philosophers treat ambiguity of evidence? And how should we interpret, for example, origins to the public? So should it be something simple, or we can say, oh, it's complex, this is paradoxical nature of archaeological evidence, I'm not sure, and so on. What do you think?
Great. Yeah. So I think that scientists, generally speaking, are in this like fascinating bind when they're communicating with the public. And part of that is to do with having conflicting aims, and part of that is to do with having conflicting audiences. On the one hand, you want to defend the authority of science, and to certain types of communities or audiences, the way that you defend the authority of science is by making science sound like it's some godlike being that kind of comes down as science says that this thing, and you go, okay, science says that thing. And the reason that kind of rhetorically works in a sense is it means that the public is supposed to sort of shut up and take a non-critical attitude and just accept what science says, right? So if I want everyone to wear masks, super useful if I can just say the big person in the lab coat in the sky has told us that we all have to wear masks. The problem with this strategy, of course, is that that's not what science is like. And as soon as the public sees that, suddenly it looks like this kind of Wizard of Oz scenario where actually there's just been this weird little old man behind the screen the whole time. It's, so that's really bad. On the other hand, if you try and communicate the complexity of science, that can lead into kinds of, as it were, sort of postmodernist narratives, if you want. That's postmodern in the derogatory sense rather than the literal sense, that start saying, well, knowledge is relative. It doesn't really, you can believe what you want, or rather what I believe is as sort of epistemically credentialed as what the person in the lab coat is saying, and so on and so forth. And so I think acts of science communication are generally incredibly fraught because of this relationship between multiple audiences and power. And in terms of archaeology and the science of origins in particular, I think that there's a couple of things to say here, and I don't think I have any real answers. Maybe. For what it's worth, my general answer is educate the public so they can think critically. A science education is not simply an education in the content of science, it's an education in the philosophy of science, and the sociology of science, and the anthropology of science, right? And the history of science. These are things that are required, I think, for you to have a sort of critical, what's the right way of putting it? the right sort of critical attitude, one that isn't merely skeptical and one that isn't merely, there's denying science, and then there's taking science at its word, and then there's somewhere in the middle, maybe slightly over here, where you're able to take a sort of critical attitude and think about science more carefully. And I think that many people can't do that.
Can we do that by storytelling?
Yes. I mean, I think clearly that, there are lots, if we're talking about it literally in a pedagogical way, I think there are, lots of really interesting ways of teaching science to students. And I think that, material engagement, right, getting them to really think about how you would try and figure that thing out, as well as telling stories about science. So I think storytelling is can be a really good way of developing these lessons. I'll give you an example. So Derek Turner and I have had sort of papers back and forth where we've talked a little bit about this display in, I'm going to forget where the museum is, but it's a display of a Tyrannosaurus Rex fighting a Triceratops. And this is a sort of very, very sort of classic example of something which I don't think any paleontologist really thinks that Tyrannosaurus Rex would lock itself in combat with a Triceratops. There are much easier things to eat. Those things are nasty, right? It's very rare. You don't get like a single, it's just a weird thing for a Tyrannosaurus Rex to do, let's put it that way. And moreover, it feeds into, a duel, a lightsaber fight, right? It's got this real cultural resonance to it. And so it seems like this is a striking image, not because Triceratops and T-Rex went into combat all the time, but because it speaks to certain types of cultural tropes that we have. Compare that to, and so that seems like, I could imagine a way that a museum exhibit could fix that by engaging the audience about it. You could imagine having the T-Rex and the Triceratops there, and then having a picture of like Luke Skywalker fighting Darth Vader, and then a picture of a shootout in a thing, and going, notice that how these kind of look similar. What do you think about that, right? Another example, which is maybe more direct, is there's this kind of there's this theory about how it is that Tyrannosaurus Rexes would have killed Triceratopses. There's this kind of, this was, so far as I know, still hasn't been published as a peer review, but it's been kind of used to do some museum displays. And the worry is, well, hang on, this is way too speculative. What role could speculation play in the public? The public's going to come away with a false idea about how confident we are about what happened in the past. And again, I think that there's a balance to be struck here by going, hey, here is the evidence that underwrites this reconstruction. What do you think? Do you think this is relevant? Here's what someone else thinks, right? And it's all about, I think, shifting the public from seeing themselves as passive containers that are getting this content, and instead becoming engaged with and questioning about science. Yeah, that's what I'll say about that.
Okay. And when we are there, can you tell us about the role of speculation in scientific interpretations? So why are they important?
Great. Now, speculation is this really weird word because when I try and publish on speculation, I get maybe 35% of audience or referees will sort of go, no, speculation is a derogatory term. Speculation just means bad science, or a certain type of bad science. If you're speculating, you're going beyond your evidence in this kind of problematic way. And I think this is an interesting kind of linguistic quirk where some people have associated speculation with this negative thing. And I happen to think that plays a pretty nasty role in science, because I think it's often a form of gatekeeping. I say, oh, this science is speculation, which is a way of me going, I'm going to dismiss it. I'm going to not pay attention to it. And maybe we need words that play that role, but I think that that particular sciences, so sciences like paleontology and archaeology, are sciences which, in a sense, need to be speculative in a certain type of way. They need to be speculative maybe for at least two reasons. One is because when you don't have those material constraints, when you don't have huge amounts of empirical data to play with, you really need to make these bold bets. You need to stretch beyond what you've got. And that doesn't mean that we should think that that stretching beyond is giving me directly the true hypothesis. What it's doing is it's giving me the sort of framework or the backdrop that's required to then start developing a more plausible story, right? You're sort of making a, initial stab. And that initial stab is critically important for you to be able to start building evidence around it. And it shifts and changes as you sort of go through. Another is going back to what I said previously about when we're doing science, historical science, say, we don't just care about what actually happened. It's often a science of capacities. It's often a science of what could happen. And if you want to understand these, if you want sort of modal spaces, if you want to understand what's possible in addition to what's actual, then you do need to speculate. You do need to say things that sort of go beyond the way things actually are. And I think it's a real shame that there isn't sort of explicit discussion of the methodology of speculation within science, right? If I'm right, and in lots of sciences, speculation is really, really important, then why is it we have these very particular standards for assertability in, when we're in the justification room? So, if I want to say that, I've got this level of certainty that this thing is this old, right? When I'm making those sorts of assertions, or, I've got to have a certain level of statistical significance, or things have got to be replicable. We've got these set standards that help guide when something is going to work or not. But with speculation, so far as I can tell, there's nothing like that. There's no attempt to even think about what the heuristics might be for doing that kind of science, at least within science. And so I guess I tend to think that if we go along with Adrian in thinking that speculation is really, really important, we need to think about how we can make a place for it within scientific institutions and scientific structures. Could we have scientific papers, in addition to your, research paper and your review paper? Could you have your, hey, I've got this weird idea paper? There's this sort of thing. Are these, could there be journals for science that is explicitly speculative? Could there be guidelines and sort of standards, or maybe just heuristics for under what circumstances this kind of speculation can be done? And maybe a last thing to sort of point out is, just as with, in the justification room, if you want, when I'm trying to work out whether I can assert that I'm confident that this thing is this old or whatever, there's this kind of, ethical and social aspect to it. There's kind of these research ethics. There also, I think, need to be a sort of research ethics of speculation, because, as has been underwriting, I think, some of your questions, it's very easy for certain things that scientists say to be taken out of context, to be used in really sort of problematic and dangerous kinds of ways. And you might think that upping your speculation ups the possibility of that happening. And how it is you might control for that, I don't really know. One general worry I have is that folks who are going to misuse science are going to misuse science no matter how careful you are. It's not obvious to me what scientists or even scientific institutions could do to stop people. They're just going to do it. They're going to find the thing and do it. It's fine. They're going to misread whatever they need to. But at the very least, I do think that it would be nice if, people who were thinking about science in a speculative frame of mind, just as when you're designing your experiment, you have to think about the ethical considerations, so also with the speculation.
Yeah, I would say that speculation is an integrative part of every archaeological thinking, as far as I know. And coming from Serbia, I know how speculation can be dangerous in zones of, for example, nationalistic use. So that's very near me.
Monika, can I, I realized as part of your question, I really wanted to hit that I didn't, which was this reference to ambiguity. Is that okay? Yeah. So I think the person who I really like on ambiguity is the archaeologist Joan Giro. So she sort of points out that the way that archaeological papers and scientific papers generally are often written are geared towards kind of certainty. What you do is you only say the things that you have the evidence to say. And so the way that you write the paper is both quite conservative, but also really geared towards saying, here is the positive evidence. Now, of course, that's not always true. There are exceptions to this rule. But generally speaking, that looks like how scientific papers are often constructed. What Giro wants to say is that we should do things differently, and what we should do is what she calls sort of embrace ambiguity. Namely, what we should be aiming to do in our archaeological work is not try and maximize our certainty by saying, oh, I'm really confident that this thing is 6,000 years old and we can attach it to this culture. That's all I'm saying. What we should be doing instead is embracing the ambiguity of going, not just in a boring way, like going, oh, it's either 6,000 or 6,500 years old, but in these interesting ways where we start generating these different hypotheses, we start exploring the different spaces that are open given the evidence that we have. A beautiful example of how you might embrace ambiguity in a way is there's a wonderful book, I can't remember the authors, called, I believe, All Our Yesterdays, where what they aim to do is they're paleo artists. They give us pictures of extinct animals, and they go and draw a bunch of dinosaurs which fit with the current evidence we have as much as the way that dinosaurs are currently presented, but look extremely different. And so you have these kind of fat cow-like theropods and these sorts of things. And it's a sort of beautiful sort of way of sort of embracing this ambiguity and also challenging the kind of presuppositions that we have. And so I suppose another answer to how should we be communicating with the public about science is, I guess, helping them to, on the one hand, embrace that ambiguity, understand that what's exciting about science, in a sense, isn't just what we know, but the spaces that we don't know and how, fascinating that is, while allowing science to retain the sort of authority that it often needs, which is kind of under threat. And I don't think those things are necessarily in conflict with one another.
I agree. I think that Steve Fuller said that today biomedical science is viewed as a standard, like physics was in the 60s of the previous century. So what do you think about that? Because contemporary state of archaeology is that we can see predominance of DNA analysis, isotope analysis, and it seems that we are losing that aspect of humanities. I may be wrong, but what do you think about that?
Wow. Okay. So I'll do the first bit quickly. I've said this a few times, but I'll just say it again. The idea that there should be one standard for scientific knowledge is to do a great injustice to the beautiful heterogeneous complexity of human minds and the nature of the world. I think I'm not against there being scientific standards, but I'm dead against there being general scientific standards. There is no one science you can point to and say, that's the science, right? The more interesting question you ask is more particular about the status of archaeology at the moment. And I think this is really interesting. It's increasingly the case that archaeologists rightly have been bringing on board the sort of new scientific techniques to do with sort of molecular data sequencing, ancient DNA, these kinds of features. And they should do that because they're methodological omnivores, right? This is a really powerful new stream of evidence. Let's grab it and use it. But the problem is that often, well, there's two problems, I take it. One is there's a danger of people thinking that that is the golden evidence, that is the evidence we need. And increasingly you find archaeologists saying, oh crap, how am I need to do some sequencing of something in here because otherwise I can't get my paper published. As a side, so philosophers occasionally will be like, oh, I should put an equation in here, but it just put in some logic that'll make it look like it's proper philosophy, right? This is a sort of similar kind of signaling that's involved in trying to get your paper published. I think a deeper problem, though, is that process can change the question that you're asking. And I quite like Alexandra Ion's got some sort of nice work on this, where demographic questions are not the same as archaeological questions. Archaeologists are supposed to understand, or traditionally are anthropologists of the past. You're interested in understanding human culture in the past. And of course, demography, the movements of people, is kind of, important for that, but that's not all it is. And so one of the dangers of having these powerful, sexy new technologies is that scientists, particularly when we're talking about, publishing practices, start acting as if they're obligates rather than omnivores. They start acting as if we really want to be focused on this one kind of data. And not only does that massively undermine, right, the whole point, well, not the whole point, but the strategy that you should take, given you're doing this kind of science, it also manipulates the kinds of questions that you ask. And I think that's bad. In the long term, my hope is there's a kind of rhythm to the introduction of new technologies. So Bob Chapman and Alison Wiley, in their book Evidential Reasoning and Archaeology, I think it is, they have this really nice chapter on the introduction of carbon dating. And it's a sort of familiar story where there's this period where everyone's really excited about a thing, then a period where everyone realizes it doesn't work as well as you thought, and then a period where it just gets integrated, it just becomes part of the furniture of doing that kind of research. A thing I would add is that it also becomes something that those scientists do. It's not something that is simply being exported from, say, physics in the case of carbon dating. It's rather becomes integrated and part of paleontological and archaeological practice. Similarly, my sort of expectation, and this may speak to my optimism about things like this kind of data, this molecular DNA data, is there's going to be, of course, this sort of flourishing period where folks are all excited about it. The technology is new. We can understand lots of cool new stuff with it. And that's going to push other questions to one side, but not for very long. Two things will happen. People will become more and more aware of the limitations of that data taken on its own. And people become more and more annoyed that they have to talk about demography all the time when they'd rather ask, anthropological questions of the past, for instance. And so I suppose my prediction would be that sometime downstream, just like carbon dating, this is going to become a very run-of-the-mill, humdrum kind of thing that some archaeologists do when relevant, this kind of thing. Now, that doesn't help archaeologists right now who want to be able to publish without making friends with someone who can do DNA sequencing, or more importantly, archaeologists who aren't in the kinds of financial or institutional situations where they have access to that kind of thing. I suppose I don't really have a suggestion for them, but I have a suggestion for the rest of archaeology, which is to let people publish without that data because it's bad.
Thank you. Thank you. Let's hope in all that you said, so in your prediction. So I want to ask something from social epistemology. For example, how can we organize scientific communities, particularly regarding scientific creativity, so that we have that messy field of archaeology, for example, or any other field?
Yeah, it's a really sort of tricky question, right? And I don't think there's going to be any sort of one answer. I suspect that one way that we can make that question slightly more manageable is to think about various kinds of ways in which scientific work gets funneled that kind of decreases its creativity. Kyle Sanford has a beautiful paper where he kind of goes through and like lists these quite well. So there's things about pedagogy, right? So the way that scientists are taught lead them to all think in particular ways. There's things about the way that publishing works, with peer review, where, there's me and I've got the other scientist who is trained the same way as me. They're going to decide whether my paper's good or not. So how should I write my paper? Well, I should write it such that my peer will like it. And that means that there's not going to be all that much room for creativity, because I have to fit within that structure that has been bequeathed to us by our scientific pedagogy. And then there are things like publishing practices and publishing standards that are going to funnel scientific research down particular avenues. And it seems like intervening on those different things can be ways of opening up scientific research. So, one that is kind of, I suppose, obvious is grant structures. So something which I think makes it really hard to be a paleontologist or an archaeologist, depending on what sort of grant you're going for, is that the structure of scientific grants tends to be, what's your hypothesis? How are you going to test it? Why should we care? If you want to go and dig up dig up some stuff in a field somewhere because you think it might be cool. It's not clear what your hypothesis is. It's not clear what you're going to find. And also, like, the chances of you finding nothing are really high. So the sort of criteria for getting grants, in addition to often being peer reviewed, which means that you have to run it by people who think like you, is also that they go towards sure bets. They go towards kind of conservative things. And even when you have grants that are supposed to be kind of blue sky thinking, that are kind of, that are supposed to be pushing the envelope, from what I've heard, at least, and this is a empirical claim that I don't have any evidence for, it's rare that they really manage that. It's rare that they manage to sort of really achieve these sorts of things. And I think the worry might be because earlier I was talking about how we haven't really thought about how to do good speculation in a sort of scientific context. We thought a lot about how to tell whether a vaccine works, right? I think we should trust very well the sort of evidence we have because we've got a really well-developed way of tracking that stuff. We don't have a really well-developed way of tracking what's going to be a productive, speculative kind of bit of science. So the sort of initial sort of thought, given that we don't have that, and I might be open to that not being a thing one could have, right? It might be that that is so context sensitive and weird that there aren't even a set of heuristics. But regardless, even if that's the case, I think the answer is going to be diversity of publishing practices, diversity of grant structures and grant applications. We do now begin to have, I think, diversity in publishing, right? Particularly in places like biology, you have various journals that have quite different criteria for when something will be published. And I think that's funky. I think for grants as well, there should be diversification in the kinds of grants. I mean, you could imagine grants that, Shahar Avin has lots of great work on how maybe we should decide grants with lotteries, right? So the idea is basically there's some minimal standard. So the application's like 2 pages long, and you get a board to just make sure that none of them are just straight out trolling. And then the rest of them, you just decide by lottery. And you imagine if you were writing a grant under those conditions, you would do something very different than what you would write if you had to think about getting it past all of these gatekeepers. And so that could be a way of kind of generating a more kind of diverse science. But again, generally, I don't think that there's any one answer to this. I think that what I would like to see in terms of the grant landscape as well as the publication landscape is a diversity in standards and practices. Because I guess the idea is, one, I guess we could think of it as a kind of experiment. It could be that there's some that just lead to absolute trash. It could be that there are some ways of organizing these things which just don't work. At which point, cool, we've learned that, don't do that thing. But more importantly, it means that there are more ways in which folks are able to get their ideas out there and developed.
Okay, to diversity.
I mean, it's a very boring answer.
Yeah. And we are near to the end of this interview, and maybe last question should be about ethical challenges of the sciences of the deep past. So what do you say? What are the main ethical challenges that we are facing now?
I mean, I think certainly in archaeology, it's very obvious in a sense what the ethical challenges are. And these are often to do with, what's the right way of putting it? The relationship between archaeological practice and indigenous owners and traditional knowledge and these kinds of things. There's some very incredibly complex, and I am far too unsubtle a thinker to be able to really grapple with them, but these sort of issues of how is it that you navigate the space between the folks who are often very, very underprivileged, who are, occupying and have some cultural lineage with the folks that you are nominally kind of studying as an archaeologist, or for that matter, as an anthropologist. And especially as in some areas such as North America and Australia, a lot of these claims, these disputes are really tied into very direct political and social concerns about the sort of, well-being of these folks, and them having the right to kind of various rights and autonomy and so forth. It's just an incredibly sort of complex kind of minefield. In terms of paleontology, there are some interesting ethical issues to do with basically the fossil version of blood diamonds, where lots of sort of amber is being taken out of what's effectively war zones in Africa. And there's sort of reasons to sort of have real ethical worries about that. In a more sort of general high-minded sense, I think that there is a really big, important lesson that is partly ethical that we get from thinking about the deep past, which is relevant, I guess, for for the world today, which is to do with the notion of normality. So, in 2016, when we had particular votes in particular Anglophone Western countries that made various Anglophone Westerners, a bit worried, there was this talk about, we must repeat that this is not normal. This is not the way that we are. With the pandemic, there's been this talk of a new normal or going back to normal. There's this kind of normality has become this very important notion for some reason. And I think that what we learn from looking at the past is that there is no such thing as normal. Humans we're very parochial. What we tend to do is we look around us and we see the way things immediately are, and we just assume that that's the way things have always been, or maybe the way that they need to be. And when you go and look at Earth's history, 120 million years ago, there were no flowers, right? There was just a world with no flowers is fundamentally different than a world with flowers, right? You had 120 million years of sauropods eating cycads, and then you get flowers emerging, and all of a sudden you get pollinating insects, you get these huge radiations in mammals and lizards and reptiles and non-dinosaur reptiles and birds. And you shift from a world that is dominated by, really, really large herbivores eating non-flowering plants to a world, the terrestrial biota for the last 100 million years is a story of pollinating insects and flowering plants. And those are profoundly different normals, right? There's, so this kind of idea that there's some stable way things are supposed to be that we should kind of return to is to really mistake the ways in which we make decisions about the way our world could be. And it's not the case that there may be rules, there may be constraints, there may be, perhaps the world can't just be anyway, but to think that there is a normal to return to, or to say we want to return to that normal, is rather to say that I want to reconstruct the world as it was. And I think it's worth being aware that there are many other options.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And I will just repeat to wild, messy, creative sciences of the past and visions of the past for the end of this interview. Thank you very much for sitting with us today. And to all of you out there who are interested and would like to know more about the project Sciences of the Origin, make sure to follow us on Twitter, subscribe our YouTube channel, and visit our webpage listed below. Thank you.
Thank you. That was so much fun.